The duality of human relationships, the nature of human interaction in organizations. Humans are social animals, and forming and maintaining relationships is essential. However, human relationships are never simple, especially interactions within organizations often involve complex hierarchical structures and ideological conflicts. This leads to conflicts between individual expectations and collective interests, often causing human interactions to devolve into meaningless calculations and manipulative negotiations. In organizational contexts, relationships transcend mere personal exchanges, becoming pivotal in power structures and resource distribution. Thus, relationships often become strategic and dualistic rather than purely benevolent. This duality is evident in the relationships between those who issue instructions and those who execute them. Simply because an instruction is carried out does not automatically establish mutual trust and respect. Instead, unseen expectations and pressures exist between issuers and executors, reducing relationships to transactional, short-term contracts. This is one of the primary causes of everyday conflicts within organizations. However, in external relationships, this duality somewhat diminishes, allowing genuine cooperation to emerge. Human relationships inherently vary depending on the context, and this is not merely theoretical but an empirically verifiable phenomenon in reality. The complexity of human relationships is not exclusive to organizational settings. Similar dynamics appear in individual lives. Humans instinctively expect rewards through relationships, encompassing both social recognition and material benefits. Yet, these expectations often remain unfulfilled and may even lead to unforeseen consequences. This illustrates that human relationships are complex structures intertwined with emotions, ideologies, and practical constraints. Therefore, understanding relationships requires considering not just the exchange of benefits but also the inherent contradictions and conflicts in human nature. This insight provides significant implications for managing human relationships within organizations. Relationships are not simple contracts but intricate structures involving emotions, beliefs, and practical limitations. Building and maintaining relationships necessitate a flexible attitude that prioritizes understanding others' perspectives over mere self-interest. This approach can become a strategy for long-term relationship building, enhancing collaboration within organizations. Ultimately, human relationships are not theoretical constructs but practical challenges we face in reality. In organizational settings, relationships often become objects of complex calculations and negotiations rather than simple goodwill. This reflects the conflict between human instincts and social structures. To fully understand these dynamics, relationships must be evaluated holistically, considering emotions, beliefs, and practical constraints, rather than solely through the lens of self-interest. This provides critical insights for forming and sustaining relationships within organizations, prioritizing long-term strategies over short-term gains. The duality of relationships, the conflict between benefit and belief. Human relationships do not merely revolve around the exchange of benefits but are complex phenomena intertwined with beliefs and values. This complexity drives both conflict and cooperation in organizations and is a key factor in understanding human behavior. The pursuit of benefit is an innate human tendency and a foundational element in forming social relationships. However, beliefs and values often take precedence over self-interest, sometimes even leading individuals to sacrifice personal gains to uphold their convictions. This underscores the complexity of human relationships, which involve emotions, ideologies, and practical limitations. The conflict between belief and benefit is a significant source of organizational tensions and cooperation. For example, when a project team prioritizes long-term strategies over short-term gains, a conflict may arise between teams focused on immediate outcomes and those advocating for a long-term vision. This is not merely a difference in calculating benefits but rather a divergence in values, what each group considers more important. Hence, relationships require not only the exchange of benefits but also understanding and respecting others' perspectives and values. From this perspective, forming relationships should prioritize long-term connections over short-term benefits. Rather than severing relationships for immediate gains, building trust can foster sustained collaboration. Within organizations, relationships must be evaluated holistically, considering emotions, beliefs, and practical constraints. This approach becomes a strategic framework for fostering long-term cooperation rather than prioritizing short-term benefits. In conclusion, human relationships are complex structures interwoven with emotions, beliefs, and practical limitations rather than simple contracts. To fully grasp this, relationships should be assessed comprehensively, factoring in emotions, convictions, and real-world constraints rather than solely focusing on self-interest. This understanding provides critical insights for forming and maintaining relationships in organizations, offering strategies that prioritize long-term connections over immediate gains. The duality of relationships and human instincts. Humans instinctively expect rewards through relationships, encompassing both social validation and material benefits. However, these expectations are often unmet and may even result in unexpected outcomes. This highlights the complexity of human relationships as structures intertwined with emotions, beliefs, and practical constraints. Thus, understanding relationships requires looking beyond the exchange of benefits to address inherent contradictions and conflicts in human nature. This insight is crucial for managing relationships within organizations. Relationships are not mere contracts but complex structures influenced by emotions, beliefs, and practical limitations. Building and maintaining relationships requires a flexible attitude that prioritizes understanding others' perspectives over self-interest. Such an approach becomes a strategic framework for fostering long-term connections and enhancing organizational collaboration. Ultimately, relationships are not theoretical constructs but real-world challenges. In organizational contexts, relationships often serve as tools for complex calculations and negotiations rather than expressions of goodwill. This reflects the clash between human instincts and social structures. To fully understand these dynamics, relationships must be evaluated holistically, considering emotions, beliefs, and practical constraints rather than solely through the lens of self-interest. This provides critical insights for forming and sustaining relationships in organizations, prioritizing long-term strategies over short-term gains. The duality of organizational relationships and practical strategies. In the real world, human relationships are not abstract theories but operate within complex social contexts. Particularly in organizations, relationships are not merely expressions of goodwill but involve intricate structures intertwined with self-interest and calculations. This dynamic impacts individual performance and shapes organizational collaboration and communication. However, this duality is not merely a problem to avoid, it is a phenomenon that must be acknowledged and strategically managed. 1. Prioritize long-term relationships over short-term gains. Many conflicts in organizations arise from prioritizing short-term results. For instance, teams might neglect collaboration with other departments to achieve immediate project goals or make decisions based on self-interest. While this may yield temporary success, it often erodes trust and damages long-term relationships. Thus, building relationships should emphasize sustainable cooperation rather than immediate benefits. This becomes a strategic approach for fostering long-term collaboration within organizations. 2. Consider emotions, beliefs, and practical constraints holistically. Humans are emotional beings, making it difficult to build relationships solely based on self-interest. This is especially critical in organizational settings. For example, if a project team bases its relationships purely on task delegation or benefit exchanges, emotional trust may fail to develop. This can hinder collaboration and negatively impact the project overall. Therefore, forming relationships requires considering emotions, beliefs, and practical limitations rather than simple calculations. This approach becomes a strategic framework for fostering long-term connections and enhancing organizational collaboration. 3. Recognize the complex nature of relationships. Human relationships are not mere contracts but complex structures influenced by emotions, beliefs, and practical limitations. Understanding this means evaluating relationships through a holistic lens rather than focusing solely on self-interest. For instance, conflicts between teams prioritizing short-term gains and those advocating long-term strategies are not just about benefit calculations but reflect differing values. Thus, building relationships requires a flexible attitude that prioritizes understanding others' perspectives and maintaining sustainable connections. This becomes a strategic approach for fostering long-term relationships and enhancing organizational collaboration. 4. Balance emotions, beliefs, and practical constraints. Human relationships within organizations often become objects of complex negotiations rather than expressions of goodwill. This reflects the tension between human instincts and social structures. To fully grasp this, relationships must be evaluated holistically, factoring in emotions, beliefs, and practical constraints rather than solely through self-interest. This provides critical insights for forming and sustaining relationships in organizations, offering strategies that prioritize long-term connections over immediate gains. 5. Embrace the holistic complexity of relationships. Human relationships are not simple contracts but structures influenced by emotions, beliefs, and practical limitations. Understanding this requires moving beyond evaluating relationships solely through the lens of self-interest. For example, conflicts between teams focused on short-term results versus those advocating long-term strategies often stem from differing values, not just benefit calculations. Thus, forming relationships demands a flexible attitude that prioritizes understanding others' perspectives and maintaining sustainable connections. This becomes a strategic approach for fostering long-term relationships and enhancing organizational collaboration. In conclusion, human relationships are complex structures interwoven with emotions, beliefs, and practical constraints. To fully grasp these dynamics, relationships must be evaluated holistically, factoring in emotions, convictions, and real-world constraints rather than solely focusing on self-interest. This provides critical insights for forming and sustaining relationships in organizations, offering strategies that prioritize long-term connections over